The poetry of Anglo-Saxon England is the oldest English poetry in existence, but it is also the fruit of even older traditions and practices. Among the members of the Germanic tribes who were the continental ancestors of the Anglo-Saxons, poetry satisfied a number of basic needs. These pre-literate cultures depended solely on the spoken word to express their beliefs, to preserve their history, and to provide their entertainment. Their poets, whose task it was to shape the spoken word fittingly for these purposes, played an essential part in all of them.
The first thing to realize about Anglo-Saxon poetry, I think, is that it's not really an early stage of English poetry. It's a late stage of Germanic poetry, because the Anglo-Saxons were Germanic peoples who came over, bringing with them a really quite ancient tradition of poetry, and that is carried on when they were in England. This means, in particular, that the metre and style of all Anglo-Saxon poetry, really, is in the traditional Germanic mode. And that means a literative verse, which is unlike modern verse in having no rhyme, doesn't count syllables, and also in the language which goes along with the metre, really. So in those technical respects, it's pretty pure Germanic verse and comparable to the kind of thing you find in early German verse.
The figures that the poet presents are set firmly in a 4th or 5th century pagan reality. Now, this is a past that, for an Anglo-Saxon Christian, was beyond hope. They lived without the benefit of the Christian revelation. Their souls, as pagans, would inevitably be damned after their death, and there was basically no hope for them. The problem for the Anglo-Saxons was that they came to England as a pagan Germanic culture which prized ancestry and prized genealogy as a major value in its whole cultural scheme. And they were very reluctant to give up on their ancestors in some ways. And many critics have seen Beowulf as an attempt at a kind of salvage project that could never be fully carried out because the poet would be up against the demands of his theology, which required that these characters be damned in the end. But nevertheless, he seems determined to present them to us in as favorable a light as possible. These are the most noble pagans imaginable. Beowulf fulfills the heroic ideal virtually without putting a foot wrong ever. In the end, the poet has to present this to us as not quite enough from a Christian perspective, but he plays with perspective in the poem very, very carefully and allows himself as much sympathy towards the heroic pagan past as a medieval Christian author could allow himself.
Nothing survives of the poetry the Germanic tribes composed, but the later poetry of Anglo-Saxon England responds quite strongly to its influence. The expressions of Christian belief and doctrine that are the primary concern of most Anglo-Saxon poets are shot through with the language, style, and sensibilities of their continental predecessors.
Although the language and verse form of Anglo-Saxon poetry is purely Germanic, it's disappointing how little there is of Germanic antiquity and paganism in Anglo-Saxon poetry. If you feel there might be exciting stuff about the Germanic gods and so on, you find really rather little. And most of what we know about Germanic religion, Woden and Thor and blood axes and so on, is derived not from Anglo-Saxon sources but from Scandinavian sources. But there are heroic legends that you find, again, not as many as you might hope, but still there are some, certainly in Beowulf and another poem called Weedseath. But on the whole, it's rather disappointing in that respect.
How the Germanic past influenced the Anglo-Saxon poet stands out the most fully in Beowulf, which is considered by modern scholars to represent one of the greatest literary achievements of Anglo-Saxon England. Beowulf is thought to have been composed between 700 and 750 AD, and is known to us because of a single surviving manuscript that dates back approximately to 1000 AD.
One has to remember that there are only about 30,000 lines of Anglo-Saxon poetry surviving in only 4 manuscripts. And what we have is not the sort of Oxford book of Anglo-Saxon verse, the best. What we have is what 4 monks chose to copy. And among other things, they chose to copy Beowulf, rather surprisingly, really. I think the man who copied Beowulf was probably actually interested in monsters, and he was compiling an Oxford Book of Monsters, if you like. So there's no guarantee at all that Beowulf was the best of its type in Anglo-Saxon history, but it's the best of its type surviving. Having said that, I don't mean that it isn't any good. It is very good, but we don't know whether it was a classic in its time.
Listen, we've had word of the might of the Spear Danes, kings of the people in ancient days, how those princes performed deeds of great valour. From hosts of enemies, from many nations, did shield shaving often seize their mead hall benches, striking terror into their leaders, long after he first was found, a destitute foundling. He knew some comfort for that, growing great beneath the skies, thriving in worldly honours, until every neighbouring tribe across the sea was compelled to obey him and offer him tribute. That was a good king.
The shield shaving mentioned here is not an English hero, but the legendary founder of a 5th century Danish dynasty, who is alluded to in a number of ancient Germanic legends. We know too little about the composition of Beowulf to understand exactly why the poet chose a Scandinavian setting for his great work. But the world he depicts in these opening lines is a pre-Christian Germanic world that haunts the verse of nearly every Anglo-Saxon poet whose work has survived. From the comparatively civilized times of the Beowulf poet, the early days were an age of stark contrast. The peace and mutual goodwill of the mead hall faced at every turn the threat of treason and violence. Violence of men, violence of nature, violence of monsters.
The author of Beowulf uses material from the Germanic past for a number of reasons. First, to give a semi-realistic historical background to the poem. Although his character is a legendary monster killer, the poet is able to put him in a historical setting that would have a great deal of resonance for his immediate audience. Beyond that, the historical material provides a contrast with the legendary matter of Beowulf's own career. In this, it provides a human perspective on the superhuman excellence of Beowulf, where Beowulf's combats with Grendel, with Grendel's mother, and with the dragon are reasonably uncomplicated affairs morally. These are figures of supernatural evil whom Beowulf is entirely justified in killing as he does. The stories of human conflict, of the passions that engender it, of the cultural situations that give rise to it, all emphasize the tangled and difficult and morally compromised character of the heroic ideal on the ground in real time, so that you have an idealized portrait of it in Beowulf contrasted against a realistic analysis of it in all its glories and failings, that's played out in the context of the historical matter. As well, history in a sense swallows this poem at the end. Beowulf dies thinking that the dragon hoard he's uncovered will be the salvation of his people, whereas various narrators in the wake of Beowulf's death let the audience know in no uncertain terms that Beowulf's death is an unmitigated disaster for his people. He's ruled them well for 50 years, and there is no one to replace him, and they are ringed with hostile peoples who will come swarming in for the kill in the wake of Beowulf's death, sooner or later. And these are the peoples that have been involved in the historical feuding with Beowulf's people, so that they are historical figures themselves and will come barging in on the poem like an unwelcome intrusion of reality into the slightly more unreal fairy tale aspect of the poem with its dragon-slaying hero.
The reputation of Scyld and of every other leader who appears in Beowulf rests on their success as protectors of their people through wise government and martial prowess. The individual hero, such as Beowulf himself, demonstrates his worth by living up to the heroic ideal that informs most Germanic literature. This ideal demands that the truly worthy man be above all honest and loyal, true to his lord, and a keeper of all his promises.
The author of Beowulf is drawn to what I call the edges of the heroic ideal in a number of ways. He tells quite a few stories along with the story of Beowulf. Modern critics refer to these as digressions, although they're generally linked very closely to the matter of the main tale. And in these, he presents us with persons and situations where the heroic ideal simply ceases to function for various reasons. Some of them involve simply bad kings who don't rule well. Some of them involve good kings who find themselves in nevertheless hopeless situations. The character of Hrothgar at the poem's opening is a classic example of this. The poet is very definite about his being a good king, yet he finds himself unable to defend his meat hall against the monsters who are haunting it.
Those who fulfill the ideal receive its greatest blessings, honour and protection in the mead hall, and the rich gifts that their lord distributes with great ceremony to show his regard for his followers' loyalty.
Well, I think Germanic poetry had always been inclined towards heroic subjects, and certainly the surviving Anglo-Saxon poetry has a lot of heroism in it, of two types really. There's a lot of what one might call Christian heroism. Treatments of saints, for example, represent them as heroes fighting in God's cause against the devil, against God's adversaries. And in The Dream of the Rood, Christ is represented very much in a heroic fashion. He strips himself for battle when he approaches the cross, for example. But the more obvious form of heroism to us is the heroism of ordinary men fighting enemies, and there's a good deal of that in Anglo-Saxon poetry. The poem called The Battle of Maldon, which comes from the very end of the Anglo-Saxon period, sometime in the 990s, getting on for 1066, is an example of that. It's a poem based on an actual battle between the men of Essex, who in those days were heroic, and the Vikings. And the leader of the Essex men, Byrhtnoth, is certainly conceived in a heroic vein, although he's also criticised for a sort of heroic rashness. And there is a sense here and in other Anglo-Saxon poems that heroes can get carried away and risk themselves and their followers unnecessarily simply out of their high heart.
This is the heroic ideal in brief. It is explored and celebrated by the poets of Anglo-Saxon England, who enter into extreme circumstances to test the ideal. To help us understand Beowulf in context, it is important to look at other Anglo-Saxon poetry. The late 10th century poem known as the Battle of Maldon, for instance, celebrates a famous English defeat. A succession of English warriors give voice to the heroic ideal as they face the stark choice between death in battle and the coward's shame should they flee.
Here shall they herdra, herde fikenra.
Thought must be the sterner, heart the keener, spirit the higher, as our strength dwindles. Here lies our leader, cut down in death, that good man stretched out on the earth. Whoever thinks to flee now from this battle play shall lament it bitterly forever.
Beowulf addresses the theme of exile in a number of different ways. Most prominently, in the case of the monsters, Grendel and his mother, who are the first on the scene in the poem, the poet describes them as descended from a race of giant beings who ultimately were descended from Cain, the first murderer. And God has exiled these because of Cain's sin in killing Abel. They're cosmic exiles, if you like, as figures of profound evil. At the end of the poem, Beowulf is fighting this dragon which has been guarding a hoard of ancient wealth. And the poet tells the story of this wealth and how it came to be buried beneath the earth by the last survivor of a culture whose material remains the gold represents. And this figure has a little song that he chants as he's putting the last of the gold in. It's often referred to as the Song of the Last Survivor, where he is in a state of mourning over his culture, which is now vanished. He's the sole representative of it, and it takes up many of the themes of exile that we see in other poems like The Wanderer. Rather ironically, the dragon's raids are prompted by the theft of a cup from his hoard, which was committed by another solitary character who appears to have fallen out of favor with his lord and is in something like that condition of exile, who stumbles on the hoard and takes the cup in an effort to buy back his lord's favor. And it's his exile, if you like, that is the spark that sets off the final crisis in the poem that will lead to Beowulf's death.
Discover the past with exclusive history documentaries from History Hit and uncover the secrets of some of the most famous people and events in history. History Hit gives you access to a growing range of documentaries presented by and featuring historians at the forefront of research and debate. Whether you are looking to find out more about charismatic leaders like Cleopatra or to discover the story behind the Industrial Revolution, History Hit will have something for you. We also aim to bring you the stories and legends that shaped our world through our award-winning podcast network. Sign up now for a free trial, and Absolute History fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code AbsoluteHistory at checkout.
If a man was cast out from society for criminal behaviour, or if by chance or cowardly design he outlived his lord, he suffered the horror of exile. This is the worst fate that can befall any member of a heroic society, where individual identity depends wholly on the support and structure of the entire community. This narrator of the Old English 8th century elegy known as the Wanderer stands in just such a predicament and gives eloquent testimony to the grief it entails. In terms of style and content, the Wanderer is often compared to the Seafarer, another 8th century poem in alliterative verse. Experts generally agreed that both poems are consistently Christian with a coherent theme, namely that of faith relieving man's loneliness. The Wanderer then appeals to others who have had similar experiences.
He who has experienced it knows how sorrow is a hideous companion to him who has few dear friends. The paths of exile claim him, not highly wrought gold, ice in his heart, not fame on earth. He remembers hall men and the giving of treasure, how his gracious lord in his youth used to show him favour. All joy has perished.
One of the pivotal moments in the history of Anglo-Saxon England was the coming of the mission led by St. Augustine of Canterbury in 597. Which resulted in the eventual conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. Some poets explored the mysteries of the new faith, using the images and ideals of the heroic tradition, depicting Christ as a successful warrior king.
There is a lot of Christian poetry in the 4 manuscripts. You've got to remember that those 4 manuscripts were written by monks, that is, they were copied by monks, and therefore they would favour Christian material. And they certainly did favour Christian material. There are versions of Bible stories, a poem called Genesis, another called Exodus. Actually, Genesis is a very interesting poem. There are also quite a lot of poems on saints' lives, St. Juliana and so on. The best of the Christian poems, and a very, very remarkable poem, is The Dream of the Rood, which is an account of, a sort of account, of the crucifixion of Christ in a very Germanicized way, really, in that Christ is represented as a hero conquering his enemies, and it's quite different from the sort of thing that one's accustomed to perhaps later, the suffering Christ and so on.
The Dream of the Rood was one of the earliest poems, written before 750 AD, as carvings recorded from around this time suggest. It is generally regarded as one of the finest, most original and perfectly constructed religious poems. The author of The Dream of the Rood, the poem that most strikingly blends heroic and Christian themes, creates an impossible paradox in heroic terms. But in Christian terms, he illuminates the central mystery of Christ's victory over death.
I could have laid our enemies low completely, but I stood fast. The young warrior stripped himself. That was Almighty God, strong and resolute. He climbed the lofty gallows, high-spirited in the sight of many, when he desired to free mankind. I trembled when that man embraced me, but still I did not dare to bend to the ground or fall upon the surface of the earth, for I had to stand fast. I was lifted up, the cross, and I raised high the mighty King.
The cross is personified here and depicts itself as a loyal follower of its Lord Christ, whom it describes as a Germanic warrior advancing boldly to battle. Yet the cross's loyalty requires that it obey its Lord's command to stand fast and become the instrument of his death, a death which medieval Christian theology interpreted as actually being Christ's moment of triumph. From this perspective, the cross's loyalty serves its Lord's purpose after all. With this unnerving dislocation of the heroic ideal, the poet has taken an abstract theological concept and made it accessible.
The Dream of the Rood views a Christian paradox through the lens of heroic ideals. Beowulf looks in the other direction. Its author regards his idealized hero from the vantage point of a Christian who feels every sympathy for the triumphs and tragedies of his pagan characters.
Despite his sympathy, the Beowulf poet acknowledges the essential hopelessness of the heroic paradigm repeatedly throughout the poem. Here, he describes how Hrothgar, the descendant of Shildshaving, has built a magnificent mead hall, a material symbol of his culture's yearning for order and harmony.
He did not fail of his boast. He distributed rings, treasures at his feast. The hall towered, lofty and wide-gabled. It awaited the destructive billowing of hateful fire. It was not yet the time when the sword-hate of son-in-law and father-in-law should awaken in deadly enmity.
Here it is the moment of triumph that contains the hidden seeds of disaster. The poet sees the new-built hall in all its glory as awaiting its eventual destruction in a feud between Hrothgar's people and those of his son-in-law, Ingelt. This was a well-known event in Germanic legend, the common stock of legend and history shared by the poet and his audience allows him to make this allusion to the fate of Hrothgar's hall with such economy.
Many of the mead hall scenes in Beowulf involve a great deal of ritual and ceremony. These express the Anglo-Saxon author's ideal of a well-ordered society, and they involve rituals and ceremonies of address, of gift-giving, of the passing around of the mead cup, of course. And all of these help to cement the bonds and ties of loyalty and trust that underpin Anglo-Saxon society, at least as a literary ideal. Beyond this, we can see how the crises in the main narrative of Beowulf, the assaults of the monsters, both those of Grendel and his mother and those of the dragon at the end, are directed in the first instance at a mead hall. It's Hrothgar's mead hall that is haunted by Grendel and his mother and made uninhabitable by night, and it's Beowulf's own mead hall that is destroyed by the dragon in his first raids. And this represents the threat from the outside to that great good place, which is the sheltered space where all the ideals of heroic society can be fully realized.
The poet also combines folklore and Christian tradition to give depth to his portrait of Beowulf's first two adversaries, the monster Grendel and his unnamed mother, who haunt Hrothgar's hall by night and devour any they find there.
The Creator had banished him among the race of Cain. The everlasting Lord avenged that murder when he slew Abel. He had no joy from that assault, for the Lord exiled him far from the race of men for his crime. All sorts of unnatural progeny arose from him, evil spirits and elves and giants as well, who warred with God for many ages. He gave them their reward for that.
It's a rather striking feature of Beowulf that the poem's hero, who over the course of a long career has many combats with human adversaries, that the poet never really focuses on those. The main narrative is involved with Beowulf's combats with the three monsters, and in the first instance this does at least simplify the moral background. In all of the stories that the poet does have to tell about human conflict, of humans fighting humans, he focuses inevitably on situations where the heroic code has broken down, where human passions can no longer be contained, where there's a great deal of moral ambiguity, inevitably, in the rights and wrongs of what happens. So that in the first instance, focusing on Beowulf's monster fights simplifies the moral background. It gives Beowulf clearly evil adversaries against whom he must contend, and there's absolutely no question about that. What is interesting is, as Beowulf nears the end of his life, as he's approaching his fight with the dragon, memories of his career as an earthly warrior start crowding back in on him. He has long passages where he recalls his lord Heolach's disastrous raid where Heolach dies and Beowulf barely escapes, and many other events in the history of Beowulf's own people, the Geats, in their contentions with various human adversaries. And it's almost as though, as Beowulf is coming to his own end, he's beginning to be overwhelmed by the human dimension of the heroic ideal, which has been absent to a great extent from his main endeavors in his fights with the monsters. And again, this could be another way of the poet showing us, in the end, the inadequacy of the heroic ideal, even as excellently embodied as it was by his main character.
The poet makes Grendel more than just a Germanic bogeyman. He is here given a lineage that goes back to Cain, the first murderer. There are also apocryphal traditions that identify the giants mentioned in the book of Genesis as the offspring of unions between earthly women and fallen angels. The poet was probably aware of these traditions, so he is here extending Grendel's horrific ancestry right back to God's original opponents, the fallen angels who rebelled against him in the deep past. From this perspective, the nightly visitations in Hrothgar's hall become skirmishes in the cosmic battle between good and evil that has gone on since before time itself. A battle which Anglo-Saxon Christians believed themselves to be engaged in as well. By having Beowulf triumph over such a creature as Grendel, the poet has paid him the highest compliment a medieval Christian author could offer a pagan hero.
It's no good pretending that everyone can enjoy Anglo-Saxon poetry. Apart from anything else, the language is very opaque. If I recite to you the opening lines of Beowulf, you'll see what I mean. What we gardene in jerdachum, theod kuninge thrum jufrunon. It's totally unintelligible to a modern English person through linguistic change, of course. So one has to learn the language, and that's a rather painful process, in fact, as many undergraduates find. But if one does learn a language and is able to read it in the original, as distinct from translations, although there are good translations, certainly, of Beowulf, but if you read it in the original, one does, I think, enter a world of extremely high and developed art. The quality of the writing, I suppose, is one thing one would want to say. It's a strange kind of writing. It's not the kind of writing that we're accustomed to. The metre is different and so on. And yet it's very polished and very brilliant. There is also, if you ask what appeals to me personally, I suppose the main thing, apart from the excellence of it, is the melancholy which broods over most of it. It is a deeply melancholy verse, as recorded in the four manuscripts. And Beowulf has a very strong sense of the sadness of life and the transience of things. And these seem to be profound truths which one can read about in poems like that to some effect.